She arrived late to the wedding, but left a millionaire utterly spellbound. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Sophia Carter was running late. Again. Her heels clacked sharply against the marble floor of the Grand Hotel, echoing through the elegant hallways as she lifted the hem of her dress, desperate not to trip. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, matching the anxiety that twisted inside her stomach. The plan had been simple. Arrive early, help with the preparations, and be the picture-perfect bridesmaid for her best friend Olivia. Instead, she was racing against time, breathless, disheveled, and cursing every single obstacle that had led to this moment. First, her cab had been late. Then, as if the universe enjoyed watching her suffer, a reckless driver had nearly run her over at the entrance of the hotel. And to top it all off, the elevator that could have saved her was packed to capacity, leaving her with no choice but to sprint up the grand staircase in her towering heels. "Excuse me. Sorry. Coming through," she mumbled breathlessly, dodging elegantly dressed guests who looked at her with confusion and mild amusement. She was nearly there. Just a few more steps, and she would slip into the ceremony unnoticed. At least, that was the hope. And then it happened. She turned a corner too fast. Her foot slipped, and before she could even gasp, she crashed into something, or rather someone, so solid that the impact sent her bouquet flying, her purse tumbling to the floor, and her body tilting dangerously forward. For a brief, horrifying second, Sophia thought she was about to face-plant onto the expensive carpet. But just as she braced herself for impact, strong hands caught her waist, steadying her before disaster could fully strike. The scent of expensive cologne filled her senses. Warm, rich, intoxicating. "Whoa, easy there," a deep voice murmured, smooth as silk, yet laced with quiet amusement. Sophia's breath hitched. She blinked up, and her heart stopped. The man in front of her was breathtaking. Dark hair styled to perfection, sharp cheekbones that could have been sculpted by the gods, and piercing blue eyes that held a mix of curiosity and something unreadable. His black tuxedo was pristine, except for the tiny crease her fall had just created where her hands had landed against his chest. Oh no. Oh God, I didn't just knock over an elderly man, did I? She blurted out, her voice still winded from the impact. The corner of his lips twitched. "Do I look elderly to you?" Sophia blinked again. No, he absolutely did not. In fact, if there were an award for the most unfairly attractive man alive, he would have won it. Twice. No, she stammered, flustered beyond belief. "But I am late, and I need to—" She tried to step back, but felt a tug. Horror washed over her as she realized the delicate fabric of her dress had gotten caught on the heel of her own shoe. Fantastic. Not only was she clumsy, but now she was literally stuck in place. The man arched an eyebrow. "Are you planning to stay like this all evening?" Sophia groaned. "Believe me, I'd love nothing more than to erase this moment from existence." He crouched slightly, unhooking the fabric from her shoe with effortless precision. "There. You're free to resume your suicide mission." She scowled. "It's not a suicide mission. It's a wedding." "At this pace, I'm not sure you'll make it past the buffet," he said, the amused smirk never leaving his lips. Sophia rolled her eyes, snatched up her purse, and straightened herself. "Well, thanks for the save, Mr. Alexander," he said simply, Something about the way he said it, confident, unbothered, sent a strange shiver down her spine. But there was no time to analyze it. Without another word, she turned on her heel and rushed toward the ballroom, determined to make her grand entrance as unnoticeable as possible. Or at least, that was the plan. As she slipped into place among the other bridesmaids, her best friend Olivia shot her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. But Sophia barely noticed, because across the room, seated among the groomsmen, was him, Alexander, and he was watching her. Again. Sophia swallowed hard. What were the chances? "Who is that?" she whispered to the bridesmaid beside her. Her friend followed her gaze, then let out a soft gasp. "Oh my God, that's Alexander Grayson." Sophia frowned. "And why does that name sound like I should know it?" Her friend gave her a look of disbelief. "Because he's one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, a self-made millionaire, owns half of New York's real estate, and according to rumors, he's cold, calculating, and never gets involved with anyone." Sophia turned back to look at him, and her stomach twisted. Because despite all those intimidating facts, he didn't look cold or calculating. He looked intrigued by her, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. A shiver ran down her spine. Something told her this night was just beginning. The ceremony had begun, but Sophia could barely focus on the vows being exchanged. Her heart was still racing from the encounter in the hallway, and no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept drifting back to him. Alexander Grayson. She risked another glance across the ballroom. He was sitting among the groomsmen, his posture relaxed, but unmistakably composed. The way he carried himself spoke of power, control, like a man who was used to people bending to his will. Yet, at that moment, those piercing blue eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Why was he still watching her? Sophia turned away quickly, trying to focus on the ceremony. Olivia was radiant, her expression a mix of joy and nervous excitement as she exchanged vows with her fiancé, Daniel. Sophia was happy for her best friend, truly. But a part of her was still reeling from what had just happened. Had she really crashed into one of the most powerful men in New York? And snapped at him without even realizing who he was? Oh God. The weight of that realization settled into her chest like a rock. There were people in this room who would kill for the opportunity to impress a man like Alexander Grayson. Investors, executives, socialites, everyone who knew of his reputation wanted something from him. And yet, the first impression she had made was practically a disaster. Perfect, just perfect. The ceremony ended in a wave of applause as the newlyweds shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Sophia clapped along with the rest of the guests, forcing a smile onto her face as she tried to shake off the lingering embarrassment. But as the guests began filing toward the reception hall, she made the mistake of looking back. Alexander was still watching her, and this time, he smirked. Sophia's stomach flipped, and she quickly turned away. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe he had already forgotten about her. Maybe she was overthinking everything. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The reception was a whirlwind of celebration, laughter, and music. The ballroom had been transformed into a breathtaking scene of elegance. Golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the dance floor, while tables adorned with white roses and flickering candles filled the room. Guests chatted over glasses of champagne, and the scent of decadent food drifted through the air. Sophia did her best to blend into the background, but fate had other plans. She was reaching for a glass of wine from a waiter's tray when it happened again. A firm, unmistakable presence stepped beside her. Too close, too intentional. Careful, a deep voice murmured. Wouldn't want another disaster tonight, would we? Sophia's breath caught. Alexander. She turned her head, and there he was, standing far too close, his cologne lingering in the space between them. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His black suit was tailored to perfection, and the way he held his glass of whiskey, casual yet deliberate, made it clear that he was a man in absolute control. Sophia straightened her posture, determined to hold her ground. Are you following me? He let out a quiet chuckle, taking a slow sip of his drink before answering. No. But you do have a habit of causing quite the spectacle. She narrowed her eyes. If I remember correctly, you were in my way. His lips curved upward just slightly. I was standing still, Sophia. You were the one running. The way he said her name sent a strange shiver down her spine. There was something about the way he looked at her, like he was analyzing her, studying every detail, every reaction. So, tell me, he continued, his voice smooth and unhurried, was your plan always to crash into strangers, or am I just special? Sophia huffed, crossing her arms. I was late, and I was trying to be a good bridesmaid, which clearly didn't go as planned. He tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. And now? What do you mean? Are you still trying to be a good bridesmaid, or have you given up on that entirely? She exhaled sharply. For your information, Mr. Grayson, I take my responsibilities very seriously. Do you? He mused. Then why do you look like you'd rather be anywhere else but here? Sophia opened her mouth to argue, but then stopped. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. She was feeling a little out of place tonight. Weddings had a way of making people reflect on their own lives, their own choices. And lately, her life had felt stuck. Like she was running, but not really getting anywhere. She was working hard, trying to prove herself as an architect, but nothing ever seemed to move fast enough. And now, surrounded by love and celebration, she couldn't help but feel a pang of restlessness. But she wasn't about to admit any of that to him. Not everything needs an explanation, she said instead. Alexander studied her for a long moment, then took another slow sip of his drink. Fair enough. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. If anything, it was charged. Then, before she could overthink it, he set his glass down and extended his hand. Dance with me. Sophia blinked. What? You do know how to dance, don't you? She hesitated. Her first instinct was to say no, to walk away before she got in even deeper. But something about the way he was looking at her, so sure, so expectant, made her pause. A small, reckless part of her wanted to say yes. She shouldn't, but she did. She placed her hand in his. The second their fingers touched, a jolt of something undeniable shot through her. Alexander led her onto the dance floor with effortless ease, his grip firm but not forceful. The music swelled, a slow and elegant melody, and suddenly they were moving. He was good, too good. His movements were controlled, precise, like everything else about him. And as much as she hated to admit it, she felt safe in his lead. You're surprisingly decent at this, she said, arching a brow. He smirked, I don't do things halfway. Their steps fell into rhythm, and for a moment, Sophia let herself forget everything. The embarrassment, the overthinking, the fact that this man was Alexander Grayson. None of it mattered. All that mattered was this moment. But then he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just low enough for only her to hear. "You intrigue me, Sophia Carter." Her breath caught. "That's not my problem," she managed to say, though it came out weaker than she intended. "No," he agreed, "but it's mine now." A shiver ran down her spine. She had a feeling this was only the beginning. Sophia barely made it through the rest of the evening without completely losing her composure. Every time she looked up, Alexander was watching her. Every time she moved across the ballroom, she felt the weight of his gaze following her, as if he were measuring her reactions, waiting for something. It was unnerving and exhilarating all at once. She told herself it was nothing. A passing curiosity on his part, a momentary game. Men like Alexander Grayson didn't just get interested in people like her. He was a billionaire, a man who walked in circles where power dictated everything. She was an architect trying to make a name for herself, not someone who had time for mysterious, intense men who looked at her like they could unravel every thought in her mind. And yet, when the night finally drew to a close, Sophia couldn't ignore the way her heart pounded when she saw him waiting just outside the ballroom doors. Her first instinct was to turn around and pretend she hadn't seen him. But before she could, he spoke. "Running away already?" She sighed, forcing herself to walk past him without stopping. "It's been a long night. I'd rather not end it with more of your observations." Alexander easily kept pace beside her as they moved toward the hotel lobby. "Observations? Is that what you think I'm doing?" Sophia stopped in her tracks and turned to face him. "Yes. You analyze people. You watch. You measure. You wait for them to react. That's what you've been doing to me all night." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Interesting theory. And what if I said I was simply intrigued?" She exhaled sharply. "Then I'd say you should find someone else to be intrigued by." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, reducing the space between them in a way that made her pulse quicken. "You're the first person in a long time who's spoken to me without hesitation," he murmured. "The first person who hasn't treated me like some untouchable entity." Sophia clenched her jaw. "That's because I didn't know who you were when I ran into you." "And yet," he mused, "even after finding out, you still haven't backed down." She swallowed, suddenly feeling like she was losing ground in this conversation. Before she could respond, Olivia's voice called out from behind her. "Sophia!" She turned to see her best friend approaching, still glowing from the night's celebrations. "Are you leaving already?" Olivia asked, pulling her into a hug. "I was looking for you. I wanted to thank you for everything today." Sophia softened instantly, hugging her back. "You don't have to thank me. You were incredible tonight." Olivia smiled before glancing at Alexander, her eyes flickering with recognition. "Oh, Mr. Grayson, I didn't realize you were still here." Alexander gave a polite nod. "A pleasure, Mrs. Kensington." Olivia beamed at the sound of her new last name, then turned back to Sophia with a knowing smirk. "So, how exactly do you two know each other?" Sophia could feel Alexander watching her, waiting to see how she would answer. She cleared her throat. "We met in the hallway," she said vaguely. Olivia's smirk deepened. "That sounds like a story I need to hear." "Not really," Sophia cut in quickly. "Just me being clumsy, as usual." Her friend looked between the two of them before letting out a quiet laugh. "Well, in that case, I'll leave you to it. But Sophia, don't leave without saying goodbye, okay?" "I won't," she promised. As Olivia walked away, Sophia turned back to Alexander, hoping he would take that as his cue to leave as well. No such luck. "You didn't tell her the whole story," he noted. "Because it's not a story worth telling." He studied her for a moment, then exhaled, as if coming to a decision. "Let me take you home." She blinked. "What?" "It's late," he said simply. "And something tells me you didn't drive yourself here." Sophia hesitated. He wasn't wrong. She had taken a cab thinking it would be easier than dealing with parking in Manhattan. But the idea of getting into a car with Alexander Grayson, after everything that had happened tonight, felt like a step towards something she wasn't sure she was ready for. "I'll call a cab," she said, reaching for her phone. "Don't bother." He nodded toward the valet station. "My car is already waiting." She hesitated again, but deep down, she knew she wasn't going to say no. Not because she trusted him, but because she was curious. And that, more than anything, was what terrified her. Without another word, she followed him to the sleek black car parked just outside. The valet handed him the keys, and Alexander opened the passenger door for her. Sophia hesitated one last time before finally stepping inside. The moment the door closed behind her, she realized she had just made a mistake. Because now, there was no escaping him. And for some reason, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The car ride was silent, but the air between them was anything but empty. Sophia kept her gaze out the window, watching the city lights blur past, her mind racing. She had no idea why she had agreed to this, why she had let herself be drawn into his world, even if just for a moment. Alexander drove with one hand on the wheel, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, when she dared glance at him, were sharp, focused. He was studying her, and that made her uneasy. "You don't like silence, do you?" he finally asked. Sophia exhaled, forcing herself to sound indifferent. "I'm fine with silence. I just don't know why we're pretending this isn't strange." Alexander smirked. "And what exactly is strange about it?" She turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the fact that a billionaire CEO is personally driving me home after we crashed into each other at a wedding?" His smirk didn't fade. "I don't see the issue." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you don't." The conversation stalled again, and Sophia shifted in her seat. The truth was, she had expected him to be arrogant, distant, maybe even dismissive of her presence. But he wasn't. If anything, he seemed amused by her reaction to him, and that only made her more uncomfortable. Minutes passed before she realized they weren't heading in the direction of her apartment. She straightened, frowning. "Where are we going?" Alexander didn't even glance at her. "Relax. I'm not kidnapping you." "That's exactly what a kidnapper would say," she muttered. He let out a soft chuckle. "I thought you might be hungry." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I assume you haven't eaten all night." She hadn't. Between running late, almost breaking her ankle, and trying not to make a fool of herself at the wedding, food had been the last thing on her mind. But she didn't like that he had noticed. "I can grab something at home," she said. Alexander made a slow turn onto a quieter street, the city's noise dimming around them. Indulge me. Sophia frowned. Why? For the first time since she got into the car, he looked at her fully, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. Because I want to. Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. Minutes later, they pulled up in front of a restaurant. A small, intimate place tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was nothing like what she expected. No extravagant rooftop views, no line of luxury cars parked out front. Just warm lighting, a few tables, and the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. She hesitated before stepping out of the car. Alexander came around to her side, watching her reaction carefully. Satisfied? Sophia crossed her arms. I was expecting something flashier. He smirked. That's the problem with expectations. They walked inside, and a waiter immediately greeted them. Mr. Grayson, it's been a while. Sophia raised an eyebrow as Alexander gave the man a polite nod. Of course, he was a regular here. They were led to a quiet corner table. The lighting was low, the atmosphere intimate. Too intimate. Sophia sat down and placed the napkin in her lap, determined to keep this as neutral as possible. Do you bring all your accidental wedding collisions here? She asked, only half joking. Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. No. She swallowed. The waiter returned, and they ordered. Sophia chose a simple dish, while Alexander ordered without even glancing at the menu. When the waiter disappeared, she exhaled. So, tell me, do you always do this? He tilted his head. Do what? Collect strays. Drag people into your world just because you can. Something flickered in his eyes. Is that what you think this is? I think you're a man who's used to getting what he wants. He smirked. And what do you think I want? She stared at him, pulse hammering. He was toying with her, testing her. And damn it, she was letting him. Sophia leaned back in her chair. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Their food arrived before he could answer, and she was grateful for the distraction. She picked at her meal, but her appetite was secondary to the energy crackling between them. Halfway through, she sighed. I should probably thank you. Alexander arched an eyebrow. For what? For not making this as insufferable as I thought it would be. He chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. Sophia shook her head, finishing the last bite of her meal. This was nice, but I should get home. Alexander nodded, settling the bill effortlessly. The ride back to her apartment was quieter, but not uncomfortable. When they finally pulled up in front of her building, she hesitated before reaching for the door handle. She turned to him. You don't do this often, do you? His gaze locked onto hers. What makes you say that? She smiled slightly. Because you're bad at it. Alexander smirked, but something about the way he looked at her told her she had hit a nerve. She opened the car door, stepping out onto the pavement, but before she could shut it, his voice stopped her. Sophia? She turned. His expression was unreadable. I'll see you soon. It wasn't a question, and that, more than anything, terrified her. The following week passed in a blur, but no matter how much Sophia tried to push that night out of her mind, she couldn't. She told herself that the dinner with Alexander had been nothing more than a strange, unexpected moment, one that held no real weight. But the truth lingered in the quiet spaces of her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see him watching her, waiting, testing, and worst of all, she felt herself anticipating their next encounter. It wasn't rational, it wasn't safe, but it was there. Sophia buried herself in work, determined to shake off whatever strange effect he had on her. But even that plan failed spectacularly when she stepped into a meeting on Monday morning and found Alexander Grayson sitting at the head of the table. She stopped short. No, absolutely not. He looked up, catching her frozen in the doorway, and his expression shifted. Just the faintest trace of amusement flickering across his features before he schooled his face back into perfect neutrality. "Sophia," he said, as if he had been expecting her. She forced herself to move, to breathe. She wasn't going to let him get in her head. Not here. Not at work. She made her way to a chair, settling in as if nothing was out of the ordinary. The director of the firm, Mr. Callahan, cleared his throat and gestured toward Alexander. "As most of you already know, we're excited to welcome Grayson Holdings as a key investor in our latest project, the Madison Tower development. Mr. Grayson will be overseeing financial strategy and coordination, working closely with our architectural team." Sophia's stomach tightened. Architectural team. Her team. Alexander said nothing, merely listening as the details of the project were laid out. He had that same sharp focus, the kind that made her feel like he was absorbing everything, every detail, every movement. Sophia kept her eyes on her notes, pretending not to notice. The meeting ended, and people began filtering out. Sophia stood quickly, hoping to escape before he could say anything to her. But just as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Miss Hayes." She inhaled slowly, then turned. "Mr. Grayson." The hint of a smirk tugged at his lips. "Avoiding me already?" She folded her arms. "I'm at work. This is work." "Of course it is." He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "But you and I both know that's not the reason you're running." Her pulse spiked. She wasn't going to do this. Not here. She lifted her chin. "If you're expecting me to be flustered, you'll be disappointed." Alexander studied her for a long moment, as if he was debating something. Then he nodded. "Good. I wouldn't be interested if you were easy to rattle." Sophia blinked, momentarily speechless. He stepped back, giving her space. "I'll see you at the next meeting." And just like that, he walked away, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding and her mind spinning. That night, Sophia met her best friend, Natalie, for drinks, hoping to clear her head. She needed normal. She needed sanity. But of course, Natalie immediately saw right through her. "You're distracted," Natalie said, sipping her cocktail. Sophia sighed. "It's work." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "Work? Or a certain billionaire you just happened to crash into at a wedding?" Sophia groaned, dropping her forehead onto the table. "Not you too." "Oh, come on. You can't drop a bomb like that and expect me to ignore it." Sophia lifted her head, glaring. "It was nothing." Natalie tilted her head. "So, you're not thinking about him?" Silence. Sophia picked up her drink and took a long sip. Natalie grinned. "That's what I thought." She sighed. "It's just, he's everywhere now. He's invested in the Madison Tower project." Natalie's eyes widened. "Wait, so you have to work with him?" "Apparently." "Oh, honey." Natalie shook her head. "You're doomed." Sophia groaned again. But deep down, she knew her friend wasn't entirely wrong, because no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, Alexander Grayson wasn't someone she could ignore. And worse, he knew it too. The tension between Sophia and Alexander had reached a breaking point. Every meeting, every passing glance, every subtle exchange of words seemed to be laced with an unspoken challenge. She had tried to maintain her professionalism, to treat him like any other investor. But that was the problem. He wasn't just another investor. He was Alexander Grayson, a man who carried an air of absolute control, who never backed down from a challenge, and who, much to her frustration, seemed to enjoy pushing her to the edge of reason. And now, they had to attend a high-profile networking event together. The invitation had arrived that morning, a formal request for the key members of the Madison Tower project to attend an exclusive gala hosted by some of the city's most powerful real estate moguls. It was an event designed to attract potential partners and solidify investor relations. She had barely glanced at the details before her boss, Mr. Callahan, pulled her aside. "Sophia, you'll be representing the firm at the gala tonight," he said. "This is an important opportunity to establish strong relationships with our investors." She nodded. Of course. Callahan gave her a knowing look. "I trust you'll handle Mr. Grayson accordingly." Sophia stiffened. "I always do." The older man chuckled. "I've been in this industry a long time. I recognize tension when I see it. Just keep things professional, all right?" Sophia forced a polite smile, ignoring the way her stomach twisted at his words. Professional. Right. The gala was held at an opulent venue overlooking the city skyline. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over the room, and the air buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from the wealthiest men and women in the industry. Sophia arrived alone, wearing a sleek black dress that hugged her figure in just the right way. Elegant, yet understated. She knew these events well. It was all about appearances, about exuding confidence and competence, about proving that she belonged in a room full of power players. She scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. And then, as if drawn by some unseen force, her gaze found him. Alexander was standing near the bar, dressed in a tailored black suit that made him look even more devastatingly composed than usual. He was speaking to a group of executives, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. It was effortless, the way he owned the space, without even trying. Sophia exhaled sharply and turned toward the nearest waiter, grabbing a glass of champagne. She needed something, anything, to steady herself before she had to face him. But of course, he noticed her first. Their eyes met from across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. A challenge, a recognition, a silent acknowledgement that no matter how much she tried to avoid him, the pull between them was undeniable. And then, to her horror, he excused himself from the conversation and made his way toward her. "Sophia," he greeted, his voice smooth as ever. "Mr. Grayson," she replied, taking a deliberate sip of her drink. He smirked slightly. "You clean up well." She raised an eyebrow. "Flattery doesn't suit you." "I disagree," he mused, tilting his head slightly. "It's just not something you're used to hearing from me." She huffed a quiet laugh. "Because it's unnecessary." His gaze flickered over her. Unreadable. "Is it?" She refused to take the bait. Shouldn't you be charming potential investors instead of wasting time with me? His smirk deepened. Who says I'm wasting time? Sophia rolled her eyes and turned away, pretending to scan the crowd. But Alexander wasn't done. I have a proposition, he said, and something in his tone made her pulse spike. She glanced at him warily. Should I be worried? He chuckled. Dance with me. Her stomach flipped. Excuse me? His gaze didn't waver. One dance. No negotiations. No arguments. She narrowed her eyes. Why? Because I want to, he said simply. Sophia hesitated, knowing this was dangerous territory. But there was something about the way he was looking at her. Something that made it impossible to refuse. So, without another word, she placed her glass down and took his outstretched hand. The moment his fingers wrapped around hers, she felt it, that same electric charge that had been simmering between them since the moment they met. He led her to the dance floor, where other couples swayed to the soft melody of a string quartet. He placed one hand on her waist, and she rested hers lightly on his shoulder, keeping the required distance, the boundaries she knew she had to maintain. But as the music played, those boundaries blurred. Sophia had danced before, but never like this. Never with a man who made her forget about everything else. Never with someone who moved so effortlessly, who led with such quiet confidence. For a few moments, she let herself get lost in it. And that was a mistake. Because when she finally looked up at him, she realized just how dangerous this was. Alexander wasn't just looking at her. He was studying her. As if he was searching for something in her expression, waiting for her to give something away. You're distracted, he murmured. She stiffened. I'm just focused. Liar, he said smoothly. Sophia clenched her jaw. You really enjoy getting under my skin, don't you? His lips quirked. Immensely. She exhaled sharply. This isn't a game. I never said it was. She shook her head, frustrated. Then what do you want from me, Alexander? The music swelled around them, but for a moment, it felt like the only thing she could hear was her own heartbeat. His grip on her waist tightened just slightly. You already know the answer to that. Sophia's breath caught, and in that moment, she realized she was in trouble. Because she did know, and she wasn't sure she could fight it much longer. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of that dance, the warmth of Alexander's hand on her waist, the intensity in his gaze, the way his voice wrapped around her like velvet. It all lingered far too long after the gala had ended. She told herself it was just a moment, a fleeting instance of weakness, but deep down, she knew better. It wasn't just one moment. It was every moment since she met him, and that terrified her. The next morning, she arrived at the Horizon construction office, determined to push those thoughts aside. She had a project to focus on, deadlines to meet, and a career she had built with discipline and control. Whatever was happening between her and Alexander Grayson had no place in any of it. Yet, the moment she stepped into the conference room, she felt his presence before she even saw him. He was already there, seated at the head of the long table, flipping through reports with his usual air of unshakable composure. His suit was crisp. His watch gleamed under the morning light, and when he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, Sophia felt her resolve waver. Miss Carter, he greeted smoothly, as if nothing had happened the night before. She forced herself to nod, setting her files down in front of her. Mr. Grayson, Their colleagues filtered in one by one, taking their seats as the meeting began. Sophia did everything she could to remain focused, to contribute to discussions about the latest developments in the Madison Tower project. But she could feel Alexander's eyes on her, watching, assessing, waiting. Halfway through the meeting, he spoke. "Miss Carter, I'd like you to stay back after we wrap up. There's something we need to discuss." Her pulse spiked, but she kept her expression neutral, of course. The meeting dragged on longer than usual, filled with presentations, budget assessments, and projections. But as the minutes ticked by, Sophia was acutely aware that she was running out of time to avoid whatever conversation Alexander had in mind. Finally, the meeting ended. People began to leave, exchanging pleasantries and gathering their documents. Sophia moved slower than usual, pretending to organize her notes. But eventually, the room emptied until it was just the two of them. She exhaled sharply and straightened. "What is it?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You've been avoiding me." She let out a short laugh. "I've been working." "Both can be true," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But you and I both know that's not what this is about." Sophia crossed her arms. "Then why don't you tell me what this is about, Mr. Grayson?" He stood up, slow and deliberate, making his way around the table until he was just a few steps away from her. "You already know." She did. That was the problem. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, reaching for her files. But before she could make her escape, Alexander's voice stopped her. "Running away isn't going to change anything, Sophia." Her grip on the documents tightened. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" He was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his next words carefully. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "Stop pretending there's nothing here." Sophia's heart pounded against her ribs, but she refused to let it show. "This is work, Alexander. That's all." He took another step closer. "Is it?" "Yes," she snapped, hating the way her voice trembled just slightly. "And I would appreciate it if you stopped making this into something it's not." Alexander studied her, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. "Tell me you don't feel it." Sophia opened her mouth to do just that, to put an end to whatever this was, but the words wouldn't come, because she did feel it. Every time he was near, every time he spoke her name, every time he looked at her like this, and Alexander knew it. The air between them was thick with something neither of them wanted to name. Finally, she forced herself to take a step back. This conversation is over. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his gaze, something almost like frustration. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He nodded once. "For now." She turned and walked away before she could do something reckless. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Sophia spent the rest of the day barely moving, forcing herself to concentrate on anything except the tension that had lingered in the conference room. The project had deadlines, demanding clients, and logistical challenges that required her full attention. But no matter how hard she tried, Alexander's words replayed in her mind. "Tell me you don't feel it." It was infuriating how easily he saw through her. More infuriating was the fact that she didn't have an answer. By the time she packed up for the night, the office was mostly empty. She told herself she was just working late to finish a proposal draft, not because she was trying to avoid running into Alexander again. But as she stepped into the lobby, Her pulse quickened at the sight of him standing near the entrance, hands tucked into his pockets, as if he had been waiting. Sophia's instinct was to turn back, pretend she had forgotten something at her desk, but it was too late. He had already seen her. "You've been avoiding me again," he said smoothly as she approached. She sighed. "Not everything is about you, Alexander." He smirked. "I'd believe that if you hadn't spent the last 3 hours pretending to be buried in work while the office cleared out." Sophia shot him a glare, but said nothing. He reached for the door and held it open for her. "Come on, I'll walk you out." She hesitated, then stepped outside. The cool evening air, a stark contrast to the heat pooling in her chest. Alexander fell into step beside her as they walked toward the parking lot. "You and I need to talk," he said after a moment. "No, we don't." His low chuckle sent a shiver down her spine. "You can keep telling yourself that, but I think we both know the truth." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Alexander, we work together. Whatever this is, it doesn't matter. It can't matter." He studied her in the dim glow of the streetlights, his gaze unwavering. "And if we didn't work together, would that change anything?" Sophia swallowed hard. She had spent years building walls around her heart, keeping herself focused on her career and nothing else. Alexander Grayson was dangerous because he made her want things she had convinced herself she didn't need. He took a step closer. "Say the word, Sophia. Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away." The air between them felt charged, her pulse hammering in her ears. But she couldn't say it, and Alexander knew. His gaze flickered to her lips for the briefest moment before he exhaled and stepped back. "I'll be at Vero's tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. She frowned. "That's a restaurant, yes," he said. "And I'm inviting you to dinner. No work talk, no pressure, just dinner." She shook her head. "I think about it," he cut in. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward his car, leaving her standing there, breathless and conflicted. The next day, Sophia told herself she wouldn't go. She told herself again as she stood in front of her closet, staring at the dress she had picked out. And again when she stepped into the cab that took her to Vero's. But the moment she walked in and spotted Alexander sitting at a private table, watching her with that quiet intensity, she knew she had lost this battle long before it began. Sophia hesitated for a brief moment at the entrance of Vero's, telling herself that she could still turn around and leave. But as soon as her gaze found Alexander's, that thought vanished. He was sitting in a secluded corner of the restaurant, his posture relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable intensity in the way he watched her. It was as if he had known, without a doubt, that she would come. Taking a slow breath, she crossed the room toward him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. When she reached the table, Alexander stood, his eyes never leaving hers. "You made it," he said, his voice calm. But there was a slight curve to his lips that hinted at something deeper. She smoothed the hand over her dress, feigning a confidence she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. "It seems that way." He pulled out her chair, and she hesitated before sitting down. It was such a small gesture, yet it made something tighten in her chest. This wasn't a business meeting. It wasn't a calculated interaction between two professionals. It was something else entirely. Alexander took his seat across from her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft glow of candlelight flickered between them, casting warm shadows on his face. Sophia reached for the menu, mostly as an excuse to break eye contact. "Have you been here before?" she asked, scanning the selections. "A few times," he admitted, leaning back slightly. "But not for something like this." She lifted her gaze. "Like what?" His lips quirked, and he didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, letting her feel the weight of his attention. Then finally, he said, "A dinner that actually matters." Sophia exhaled, setting the menu down. "Alexander, what are we doing?" His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "I was hoping you could tell me." She swallowed, suddenly feeling warm. "We work together. You know that." "I do," he said, nodding. "And I also know that I haven't stopped thinking about you since the wedding." Her heart thudded painfully. "Alexander." "I'm not saying this lightly, Sophia," he cut in, his voice lower now. "I've spent years making sure my life was controlled, focused, without complications. And then you crashed into it, quite literally, and everything changed." She opened her mouth, but no words came. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "So, I need to know," he continued, his gaze locked onto hers. "Am I the only one feeling this?" Sophia's breath caught, because the truth was, she had felt it from the very beginning. The pull, the connection, the unspoken understanding between them that defied reason. But saying it out loud meant surrendering to it, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. The waiter appeared then, breaking the moment, and Sophia exhaled shakily as they placed their orders. When they were alone again, she focused on the candle in the center of the table, tracing the rim of her glass with her fingertips. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted finally, her voice quiet. Alexander studied her for a long moment. Then, with a softness she wasn't expecting, he said, "Then let's figure it out together." Something in her chest ached at that, because, despite everything, a part of her wanted to believe him. Maybe she already did. Sophia stood on the rooftop of her apartment building, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she looked out over the shimmering city skyline. It had been a long, exhausting week, one filled with emotions she wasn't entirely sure how to process. And at the center of it all was Alexander. She had spent years building walls, ensuring that nothing and no one could shake the foundation of her carefully structured life. And yet, Alexander had walked straight through those barriers as if they had never existed in the first place. A part of her had wanted to run. Maybe she still did, but another part, a much louder, much braver part, knew the truth. She didn't want to lose him. The sound of the rooftop door opening behind her sent a shiver down her spine, and even before she turned, she knew who it was. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," Alexander said, his voice carrying through the quiet night. Sophia let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Should I be concerned that you know me this well already?" He stepped forward until he was beside her, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "It's not about knowing you," he said, watching the city lights. "It's about understanding you." Sophia swallowed hard, her pulse unsteady. She had spent the last few days pushing him away, telling herself that getting involved with him was a mistake, that it would only complicate their lives. But standing here now, with him so close, she couldn't bring herself to believe any of those excuses. After a long silence, Alexander finally spoke again. His voice quiet but firm. I haven't stopped thinking about you, Sophia, and I'm done pretending not to. She turned to him, her heart racing. Alexander, tell me you don't feel the same way. He cried, his piercing gaze locking on hers. Tell me you haven't thought about me. This, every single day since the night. She couldn't speak. Because the truth was, she had it. Every moment she had spent there, every stolen glance, every touch, it had all consumed her in ways she had never expected. Alexander took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. Say the word, and I'll walk away, he whispered, his voice low, steady. But if you don't, I need you to tell me the truth. Right here. Right now. Sophia's breath hitched. This was the moment she had been avoiding, the moment that would change everything. She could push him away again. She could pretend this wasn't real. Or she could finally stop fighting. Her pulse thundered as she took a single step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want you to walk away. Alexander exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Then stop running. Sophia hesitated for only a fraction of a second before she made her choice. She reached for him. And in that instant, Alexander pulled her in, his hands cupping her face as he kissed her. Not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with the kind of intensity that left no room for doubt. Sophia melted into him, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt, her entire body surrendering to the inevitable. This was real. This was everything, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. Sophia never expected that a single moment of chaos would change her life forever. She had spent years building a future that made sense, one that was structured and predictable. Love was never a part of the plan. But all of that unraveled the day she ran straight into Alexander's arms, quite literally, in the middle of a wedding she was already late for. From the start, he was different. He didn't just see her. He understood her in ways she wasn't ready to accept. He challenged her, made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. And despite every wall she put up, he never once walked away. But Sophia had always been good at running. She convinced herself that they came from two different worlds, that whatever was happening between them was temporary, fleeting, something that would fade if she ignored it long enough. But it didn't, and no matter how much distance she tried to put between them, she couldn't escape the way her heart raced whenever he was near, the way his voice stayed with her even in the quiet. Love wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to feel terrifying and overwhelming. Wasn't supposed to make her feel as if she was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the moment she would fall. But the truth was, she had already fallen. The real question was whether she would let herself land safely or continue bracing for an impact that might never come. Alexander was patient, but even he had his limits. The night he told her he was stepping back, that he wouldn't force her into something she wasn't ready for, was the moment Sophia realized she had been trying so hard to protect herself from heartbreak that she had been breaking both of them in the process. He had given her every reason to believe in him, in them, but fear had made her blind. And now, standing in the emptiness of her apartment, staring at the space where he used to be, she felt the crushing weight of what she had lost. But love, real love, doesn't disappear just because you're afraid of it. It lingers, waits, hoping you'll be brave enough to choose it before it's too late. And so, for the first time in her life, Sophia stopped running. She found him exactly where she knew he would be, standing at the edge of the city, looking out at the world with that same quiet confidence he always carried. Her heart pounded as she walked toward him, as she finally let the words spill out that she had been too afraid to say. She told him she was scared, that she didn't know how to do this, that love had never been safe for her. And Alexander, ever so steady, ever so patient, simply cupped her face in his hands and told her that love was never about safety. It was about trust, about choosing someone even when it scared you, about standing still even when every instinct told you to run. And so she chose. She chose him. Chose to stop running. Chose to believe that love, no matter how uncertain or terrifying, was worth the risk. And when he pulled her into his arms, pressing his lips against hers with the kind of quiet desperation that only comes from almost losing something you can't live without, she knew she had made the right choice. Their love wasn't perfect. It never would be. But that was the beauty of it. Because love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone again and again, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when every fear inside you tells you to walk away. And as Sophia looked into Alexander's eyes, she knew, without a doubt, that she would choose him every single time. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing you powerful and emotional stories that touch the heart. Tell us in the comments, have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between fear and love? How did you overcome it? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Stay tuned for more heartwarming, dramatic, and unforgettable stories coming soon.